There is a kind of person you cannot argue with, not because they're stubborn, but because they've stopped needing to win. Their calm disarms aggression. Their silence dismantles chaos. You can shout, accuse, twist their words, but their mind stands still like a mountain in a storm. They understand what most people never do, that every argument is a mirror, every insult is a projection, and peace is not weakness, but mastery. This is the mind trained by Stoicism, a discipline older than empires, sharper than logic, and deeper than emotion. The Stoic doesn't escape pain, they transform it. They don't reject reality, they understand it. And once you think like that, nobody argues with you again, not because you silence others, but because you have silenced yourself. The mind at war with itself makes more noise than 1,000 battles. You wake, and already the trial begins. The alarm pierces the quiet darkness, and before your feet touch the floor, the thoughts arrive like uninvited guests at a funeral. What did they mean by that comment yesterday? Why didn't they respond to your message? What if today goes wrong? What if you're not enough? What if you've never been enough? The modern human wakes not into mourning, but into anxiety. You scroll through your phone, that glowing oracle of comparison and catastrophe, and within minutes you've absorbed the curated perfection of strangers, the outrage of distant conflicts, the advertisements promising you completeness if only you buy, consume, become. Your coffee grows cold as you argue with someone in your head, someone who isn't even there. You rehearse conversations that will never happen. You replay moments that are already gone, editing them, rewinding them, wishing you had said this instead of that. This is the noise within. Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher who was born a slave and died freer than emperors, once wrote, "We suffer more in imagination than in reality." He understood something that escapes most people even today, 2,000 years later. The wars we lose are not fought on battlefields or in boardrooms. They are fought in the space between our ears, in the theater of thought, where we play both hero and villain, prosecutor and defendant, judge and condemned. Modern psychology calls this rumination, the compulsive rehearsal of negative thoughts, the mental tape that plays on loop. Cognitive science has mapped it, measured it, given it clinical names. But the Stoics knew it intimately, felt it deeply, and more importantly, discovered how to quiet it. You see, the noise within is not random. It follows patterns, ancient patterns encoded in our psychology. It is the ego defending itself against perceived threats. It is the primitive brain scanning for danger, finding it everywhere, because that's what kept our ancestors alive. The problem is that the threats have changed, but the machinery hasn't. We are not running from predators anymore. We are running from the possibility of being wrong, of being rejected, of being less than we imagine we should be. Every argument you have, every heated debate, every passive-aggressive text, every silent treatment begins long before words are spoken. It begins in this internal chaos, this desperate need to be right, to be validated, to have your version of reality confirmed by someone else. You argue because you are afraid. You are afraid that if you are wrong about this, you might be wrong about everything. And if you're wrong about everything, then who are you? The noise within is the sound of a self that doesn't know itself, desperately seeking confirmation from the outside world. Think about the last time you found yourself in an argument that spiraled out of control. Maybe it started small, a comment about politics, a disagreement about where to eat, a misunderstood tone in a text message. But somehow it grew, voices raised, words weaponized. The original point forgotten, replaced by something deeper, older, more primal. It wasn't about the restaurant anymore. It was about respect, about being heard, about mattering. And in that moment, you were not thinking. You were reacting. Your heart rate increased, your muscles tensed, your prefrontal cortex, that sophisticated part of your brain responsible for reason, took a back seat while your amygdala, that ancient alarm system, took the wheel. You became temporarily less than human. You became animal, threatened, defensive, dangerous. This is what happens when we live at the mercy of the noise within. The Stoics recognize this immediate visceral response as the first movement, the proton pathos, the initial impression that strikes us before reason can intervene. They understood that we cannot prevent these first movements. They are automatic, biological, hardwired. But they also understood something revolutionary. We can control the second movement. We can control what we do with that initial impulse. Most people never learn this. They spend their entire lives as passengers in their own minds, watching thoughts arise and believing every single one, following every emotional impulse as if it were divine command. They are like ships without rudders, blown by every wind of feeling, crashed against every rock of circumstance. The noise within convinces them that their thoughts are reality, that their feelings are facts, that their perceptions are truth. Someone looks at them the wrong way, and they construct an entire narrative of disrespect. Someone doesn't text back immediately, and they compose a mental prosecution case for abandonment. Someone disagrees with them, and suddenly it's not just a different opinion. It's a threat to their entire existence. This is the trap. This is the prison most people live in without even knowing they're imprisoned. And the bars are made of thoughts. The tragedy is not that we have these thoughts. The tragedy is that we believe we are these thoughts. We have so thoroughly identified with the voice in our head that we cannot imagine a separation between the thinker and the thought, between the observer and the observed, between the self and the story the self tells. But there is a gap, a space, a silence, and in that silence lives the possibility of freedom. The Stoics spent lifetimes exploring this gap, training themselves to recognize the noise for what it is, not truth, but interpretation, not reality, but perception, not the world as it is, but the world as it appears through the distorting lens of fear, desire, ego, and conditioning. You are not your thoughts. You are the awareness that witnesses thoughts. And once you understand this, truly understand it, not just intellectually but experientially, everything changes. The noise begins to quiet. The wars begin to end. And you discover something extraordinary. The person you were arguing with all along was never the other person. It was always you. You were at war with yourself, projecting that war onto the world, demanding that others validate the story you were telling, furious when they wouldn't play their assigned roles in your internal drama. This is where transformation begins, not in victory over others, but in recognition of the battlefield itself. The noise within is the first enemy, and it is the only enemy that truly matters. Control is the most seductive illusion humanity has ever created. We believe desperately that if we argue hard enough, plan thoroughly enough, worry intensely enough, we can bend reality to our will. We believe that the right words, the perfect strategy, the most devastating comeback will finally give us what we seek: power over the uncontrollable, certainty in an uncertain world, peace through domination. This belief is killing us. Not quickly, not dramatically, but slowly, like a poison we willingly drink each day, convinced it's medicine. We exhaust ourselves trying to control things that were never ours to control. We argue with people who will never change their minds. We replay the past as if our rumination could rewrite history. We rehearse the future as if our anxiety could prevent catastrophe. The Stoics called this the fundamental delusion, and they built their entire philosophy on its demolition. Epictetus, writing from experience that would break most modern people, divided all of existence into two categories: things within our control and things beyond it. It sounds simple, almost childishly obvious. Yet if you actually examine your daily suffering, you'll find that nearly all of it comes from violating this simple truth. You suffer because you want someone to love you who doesn't. That is outside your control. You suffer because you want the weather to cooperate with your plans. Outside your control. You suffer because you want people to understand you, respect you, agree with you, validate you. All of it, every bit of it, outside your control. What then is within your control? Only this: your response, your interpretation, your judgment, your will. That's it. That's the entire kingdom you actually rule. And for most people, it's the only kingdom they never bother to govern. Modern psychology, particularly cognitive behavioral therapy, has rediscovered this ancient wisdom and wrapped it in new language. Aaron Beck and Albert Ellis, the pioneers of CBT, essentially reconstructed Stoicism for the 20th century. They taught that it's not events themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about those events. They taught that we can change our suffering by changing our thinking. The Stoics said the same thing 2 millennia earlier. Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, the most powerful man in the known world, wrote in his private journals, "If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it, and this you have the power to revoke at any moment." Read that again. The Emperor of Rome, commanding legions, governing an empire that stretched from Britain to Africa, knew that his true power lay not in his armies, but in his mind. He knew that the invisible enemy, the one that could actually defeat him, was not the barbarians at the gates, but his own unchallenged judgments about what was happening. Consider the modern battlefield, social media. Here is where the invisible enemy reveals itself most clearly. You post something, an opinion, a photo, a moment from your life. Within minutes, the responses arrive. Some praise, some critique, some attack. Your heart rate changes, your mood shifts. You refresh the page compulsively, seeking validation, dreading condemnation. You craft responses, delete them, rewrite them, imagining how each word will land, how each phrase will be interpreted. You have just given strangers complete power over your emotional state. You have surrendered your inner kingdom to people who don't know you, who don't love you, who will forget about you before their next meal. This is the invisible enemy at work. Not the people commenting, but your belief that their opinions matter, that external validation can fill an internal void, that you can control how others perceive you if you just find the right words, the right image, the right performance. The existentialists, particularly Jean-Paul Sartre, explored this from a different angle. Sartre wrote about bad faith, the human tendency to deceive ourselves about our own freedom. We pretend we have no choice. We say, "I had to respond," or "they made me angry," or "I couldn't help it." But this is a lie we tell ourselves to avoid the terrifying responsibility of our own freedom. You always have a choice. You can choose not to engage. You can choose to let the insult pass. You can choose to be misunderstood. You can choose to lose the argument, but we don't, do we? We don't, because the invisible enemy whispers, if you don't fight back, you're weak. If you don't defend yourself, you're worthless. If you don't win, you're nothing. And we believe it. The invisible enemy is not outside you. It's the part of you that needs to be right more than it needs to be at peace. It's the part that would rather be validated than be free. It's the ego, that fragile construction of identity that must constantly defend itself against the perceived threats of a world that, truthfully, isn't thinking about you nearly as much as you imagine. Viktor Frankl, writing from the hell of Nazi concentration camps, discovered something that the Stoics knew. The last human freedom is the freedom to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. Even when everything external had been stripped away, family, possessions, dignity, even his own name, Frankl realized that his captors could not take his inner freedom unless he surrendered it. This is the secret the invisible enemy doesn't want you to know. It has no power except what you give it. Every argument you cannot walk away from is a chain you've forged yourself. Every opinion that disturbs your peace is a weapon you've handed to the other person. Every need for validation is a door through which manipulation can enter. The Stoics trained themselves to identify these chains, these weapons, these doors. They practiced what they called premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. Not to be pessimistic, but to be prepared. They imagined losing everything, wealth, status, loved ones, life itself, not to torture themselves, but to realize that their peace could not depend on keeping these things. If your happiness requires that everyone agrees with you, you will never be happy. If your peace requires that circumstances always favor you, you will never have peace. If your worth depends on external validation, you will always be at war. This is the invisible enemy's greatest trick, convincing you that freedom lies in controlling the external world, when true freedom only comes from mastering the internal one. Most people spend their entire lives fighting battles they cannot win, trying to control variables that were never theirs to control, exhausting themselves in arguments with reality itself. They argue with the weather, with aging, with other people's opinions, with the past, with death. They argue with the fundamental nature of existence, demanding that it be different than it is, furious that the universe does not conform to their preferences. And they wonder why they're tired. The Stoics offer a different path. Not resignation, not passivity, not weakness, but focused power. They teach us to pour our energy not into changing what cannot be changed, but into mastering what can, our attention, our interpretation, our response, our will. This is the work. This is the practice. This is how we defeat the invisible enemy. Not by winning arguments, but by seeing through them. Not by controlling others, but by governing ourselves. Not by demanding the world change, but by transforming how we meet the world. The invisible enemy falls not when we fight harder, but when we finally understand what we were fighting for was never real to begin with. 24 centuries ago, in a painted colonnade in Athens called the Stoa Poikile, a merchant named Zeno began teaching a philosophy that would outlast empires. He had lost everything in a shipwreck: his cargo, his wealth, his carefully constructed life plans, and washed ashore in Athens with nothing. Most men would have been destroyed by such loss. Zeno studied philosophy instead, and from his study, from his contemplation of loss and impermanence, he developed a school of thought that would guide emperors, slaves, soldiers, and senators through the next 500 years. They called his followers the Stoics. after the painted porch where he taught. But the name is almost ironic now, weighed down by centuries of misunderstanding. In common language, Stoic means emotionless, cold, indifferent, someone who doesn't feel. This could not be further from the truth. The Stoics felt everything. They simply weren't controlled by what they felt. They understood something that modern neuroscience is only now confirming. Emotions are information, not instructions. Feelings are weather patterns in consciousness, not laws that must be obeyed. Zeno taught in that painted colonnade, but the philosophy he founded would travel through time like a signal across centuries. It would pass through Cleanthes, his devoted student, then to Chrysippus, the brilliant systematizer who wrote over 700 books, all lost now except in fragments and quotations, ghosts of wisdom haunting the margins of other texts. But Stoicism did not die with the Greeks. It traveled to Rome, where it met a world of power, corruption, excess, and violence. And there, in the heart of empire, it found its greatest practitioners. Seneca the Younger, born into wealth and educated in rhetoric, became advisor to emperors and one of the richest men in Rome. He also became a Stoic philosopher, writing letters and essays that dissected human nature with surgical precision. He understood hypocrisy intimately, including his own. He wrote about poverty while living in a palace. He counseled moderation while accumulating fortune. Yet his writings remain profound because he never claimed to have mastered the philosophy, only to be practicing it, failing at it, learning from it. Seneca wrote, "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality." He wrote about how to face death, how to use time wisely, how to handle anger. He wrote these things knowing he would one day be forced to live them. When the Emperor Nero, his former student, ordered him to commit suicide, Seneca faced death with the calm he had spent decades cultivating. He cut his wrists in a warm bath, dictating philosophy to his scribes until consciousness faded. Whether he felt fear, we don't know. The Stoics weren't trying to eliminate fear, only to not be ruled by it. Then there was Epictetus, born a slave in Hierapolis, property of one of Nero's secretaries. He was crippled, possibly from torture, possibly from disease. He lived in chains while free men walked past. Yet Epictetus discovered something they hadn't, that no one could enslave his mind unless he allowed it. After gaining his freedom, he taught philosophy in Nicopolis, and his lectures were recorded by his student Arrian in a book called the Enchiridion, the Handbook. These lectures remain startlingly modern, startlingly relevant. Epictetus speaks across 20 centuries as if he's sitting across from you right now, asking, what is within your control? What is outside it? Why are you disturbing yourself over things that are not yours to command? He taught that we are not disturbed by events, but by our judgments about events, that we can choose our response to anything that happens, that freedom is not the absence of constraints, but the wisdom to understand which constraints actually matter. And then, at the apex of Roman power, Stoicism found its most unlikely champion, Marcus Aurelius, emperor and philosopher, commanding legions while contemplating mortality, wielding absolute power while remembering its impermanence. Marcus didn't choose to be emperor. He was adopted and trained for it, prepared from youth to shoulder the weight of an empire. And that weight was immense. Wars on multiple fronts, plagues devastating cities, betrayals from within. His own son Commodus would become one of Rome's worst emperors, unraveling much of what Marcus had built. Yet through all of this, through war, disease, political intrigue, and personal loss, Marcus kept a private journal. He wrote in Greek, the language of philosophy, not Latin, the language of power. He wrote these entries for himself, never intending them to be published. They were reminders, recalibrations, returns to first principles. We know this journal now as the Meditations, and it is one of the most intimate documents in human history. Here is the Emperor of Rome, the most powerful man on earth, reminding himself each morning that he will meet difficult people today, liars, ingrates, the arrogant and selfish. But he reminds himself that these people act from ignorance of good and evil. They are doing what they think is right, even when they're wrong. And more importantly, he cannot be harmed by them unless he judges their actions as harmful. You have power over your mind, not outside events, he wrote. Realize this, and you will find strength. This is the ancient mirror the Stoics offer us. When we look into their texts, into their lives, we see not primitive thinking or outdated philosophy, but a reflection of our own struggles rendered with startling clarity. They faced the same human condition we face, the same fears, the same desires, the same tendency toward distraction and self-deception. They dealt with difficult people, unfair circumstances, illness, loss, and death. The technologies were different. The togas replaced by business suits, the forums replaced by Twitter, but the fundamental questions remained identical. How do we live well in a world we don't control? How do we maintain peace when everything around us is chaos? How do we respond to injustice, to betrayal, to loss? How do we face our own mortality with courage instead of denial? The Stoics didn't have answers in the sense of formulas or guarantees. What they had was a practice, a discipline, a way of training the mind to meet reality as it is rather than as we wish it to be. They understood that suffering is inevitable, but that much of our suffering is optional, added by our own resistance to what is. They understood that we cannot control what happens to us, but we can control our response. They understood that peace is not a circumstance, but a skill, cultivated through daily practice, strengthened through repeated application. This is why Stoicism has survived, not because it promises happiness or success or material wealth, but because it offers something more valuable, a way to be unshakable in a world designed to shake us. The ancient mirror reflects back our modern faces. The colonnade in Athens, the letters of Seneca, the lectures of Epictetus, the midnight thoughts of Marcus Aurelius. All of it speaks to now, to this moment, to the particular chaos of your particular life. Because human nature hasn't changed. We're still caught in the same loops, the same patterns, the same suffering. We still believe that external circumstances determine internal states. We still fight battles we cannot win. We still give our peace away to anyone who knows how to press our buttons. But the Stoics offer us the way out, not through escape, not through denial, but through understanding. They teach us to see clearly, to distinguish between what we control and what we don't, to accept what is while working to improve what can be improved, to respond rather than react, to be present rather than lost in fantasies of past and future. This is the wisdom that has survived slavery and empire, war and plague, the rise and fall of civilizations, because truth doesn't age. And what the Stoics discovered about the human mind, its traps, its possibilities, its path to freedom, remains as true now as it was when Zeno first began teaching in that painted colonnade, when Seneca dictated his last words, when Epictetus reminded his students that they were free, when Marcus sat alone in his tent on the frontier of empire, writing by candlelight about how to live. The ancient mirror reflects eternal truths. And when we look into it, we see ourselves. Inside every human being is a civil war, not the kind fought with weapons, but something more intimate and more constant. A war between what we feel and what we know, between impulse and intention, between the animal we evolved from and the being we aspire to become. You feel this war every day, though you might not name it as such. You know you shouldn't check your phone the moment you wake, but you do. You know that argument isn't worth having, but you engage anyway. You know that worry won't change the outcome, but you worry regardless. You know that person isn't good for you, but you return to them again and again. This is the battlefield between emotion and reason. The Stoics understood this war intimately. They didn't see emotions as enemies to be destroyed, but as forces to be understood and, crucially, to be governed. They developed a concept that has been tragically misunderstood for centuries: apatheia. In English, this became apathy, which we associate with not caring, with numbness, with emotional death. But this is a mistranslation so severe it has obscured one of philosophy's most important insights. Apatheia doesn't mean the absence of emotion. It means freedom from being enslaved by emotion. It means experiencing feelings without being controlled by them. It means the ability to feel fear and still act with courage, to feel anger and still respond with wisdom, to feel grief and still find meaning. The Stoic doesn't become a stone. The Stoic becomes a mountain, moved by wind and weather, shaped by time, but fundamentally unshaken, fundamentally grounded, fundamentally itself. Modern neuroscience helps us understand why this civil war exists in the first place. We have, in essence, three brains layered on top of each other through evolution. The reptilian brain, oldest and deepest, handles survival, hunger, reproduction, threat response. This is the part that floods your body with adrenaline when you perceive danger, that makes your heart race, your muscles tense, your thinking narrow to a single point. Survive. The limbic system, the mammalian brain, processes emotions and memory. This is where love lives, where social bonds form, where trauma embeds itself. This part wants belonging, comfort, pleasure. It remembers pain and seeks to avoid repeating it. It forms attachments and fears abandonment. And then the newest addition, the neocortex, the human brain, the part that reads philosophy, makes plans, contemplates mortality, imagines futures that don't exist yet. This is where reason lives, where abstract thought emerges, where we become capable of overriding our own instincts. The problem is that these three parts don't always agree. In fact, they often contradict each other violently. Your rational brain knows that public speaking is safe, but your reptilian brain screams danger and floods you with fear. Your rational brain knows you should save money, but your limbic system craves the immediate pleasure of purchase. Your rational brain knows you need to leave that relationship, but your emotional brain is terrified of being alone. This is the war, and most people lose it every single day. They lose it because they've never learned to observe it. They experience the surge of emotion and believe it is reality. They feel afraid and assume there must be danger. They feel angry and assume they've been wronged. They feel desire and assume they should pursue it. The Stoics practiced something revolutionary. They learned to insert a pause between stimulus and response. They learned to observe the first movement, that initial surge of emotion, without immediately acting on it. They learned to say, "I notice I'm feeling angry," but I am not my anger. I can feel this and still choose my response. This is not suppression. Suppression is pushing down emotion, pretending it doesn't exist, building pressure until it explodes. That's not mastery, that's a time bomb. What the Stoics practiced was acknowledgement and choice. Feel the emotion fully, recognize it, name it. Then ask, is this feeling a reliable guide to action right now? Or is it old programming, a survival instinct misfiring, a conditioned response that no longer serves me? Seneca wrote extensively about anger, and his insights read like they were written yesterday. He recognized that anger feels righteous. It feels like justice. It convinces us that our rage is proportional to the offense, that our retaliation is deserved, that the other person made us feel this way, so they deserve what's coming. But Seneca knew the truth. Anger is a temporary madness. It narrows our thinking, distorts our perception, and almost always makes things worse. The satisfaction of revenge is brief and hollow. The damage it causes to relationships, to reputation, to our own peace is lasting. Yet he didn't say, never feel anger. He said, when you feel anger rising, pause. Ask yourself what happened. Ask yourself what you're interpreting. Ask yourself what the anger is trying to protect. Ask yourself if action taken from this state will make things better or worse. This pause is everything. This pause is where freedom lives. Carl Jung, working 2,000 years after the Stoics, but arriving at similar conclusions, described what he called individuation, the process of integrating all parts of ourselves, including the shadow, the parts we reject or deny. Jung understood that we cannot eliminate our darker impulses, our primitive reactions, our emotional volatility. We can only become conscious of them. And consciousness transforms everything. When you can observe your own anger, you are no longer fully identified with it. When you can watch your own fear, you've already created distance from it. When you can witness your own thoughts, you've discovered that you are not those thoughts. You are the awareness that perceives them. This is the gap, the space between stimulus and response, the moment of choice. Viktor Frankl, in perhaps the most extreme test of human psychology imaginable, discovered this gap in a concentration camp. Between what happened to him and his response to it, there was a space. In that space lay his freedom, the one thing his captors could not take. He could not control the brutality, but he could control what it meant to him. He could not prevent suffering, but he could choose whether that suffering had meaning or was merely absurd cruelty. This is what the Stoics called prohairesis, moral choice, will, intention. It's the part of you that can step back from every circumstance and decide, how will I meet this? What kind of person will I be in this moment? It's not about suppressing emotion, it's about not being suppressed by emotion. Think about the last time you reacted poorly to something, snapped at someone you love, sent an angry message you regretted, made a decision from fear or insecurity. If you replay that moment honestly, you'll probably see that there was a tiny space, a millisecond, where you could have chosen differently. But the emotion was so strong, so immediate, so consuming, that it felt like you had no choice. This is the illusion. This is what the Stoics trained themselves to see through. You always have a choice, even when the choice is incredibly difficult, even when every fiber of your being is screaming to react, even when the emotion feels like it will kill you if you don't discharge it immediately. The Stoics practiced daily exercises to strengthen this capacity for choice. They would imagine challenging scenarios, someone insulting them, losing their wealth, facing exile or death. Not to be morbid, but to rehearse different responses, to train the mind to observe, to pause, to choose. They understood that this capacity is like a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it becomes. The first time you try to pause in the grip of rage or fear, it might last half a second. But that's enough. That half second is the crack where light enters. That half second grows. Practice by practice, pause by pause, you reclaim territory in the civil war. You become less reactive and more responsive. You feel emotions as fully as ever, but you're no longer their hostage. You can feel grief and still function. You can feel fear and still act. You can feel desire and still wait. This is apatheia. This is the freedom the Stoics promised. Not freedom from emotion, but freedom within emotion. Not the absence of the war, but the wisdom to know which side to fight for. Between emotion and reason is where you live. Between impulse and intention is where character forms. Between stimulus and response is where power actually exists. And once you learn to inhabit that space, once you make it your home, everything changes. Not because the world becomes easier, but because you become unshakable. The first victory is not over your enemy. It is over your own impulse to react. This is what separates those who master themselves from those who are forever mastered by circumstance. This is the invisible line between freedom and slavery, between peace and perpetual agitation, between wisdom and the endless repetition of the same mistakes. Seneca understood this with painful clarity. In his letters to Lucilius, his young friend and student, Seneca wrote about the moment that determines everything, the instant between provocation and response. He knew that in that brief space, too small to measure but infinite in consequence, lies the entire possibility of transformation. The greatest remedy for anger, he wrote, is delay. Simple, almost absurdly simple. Yet, how many relationships have been destroyed? How many careers ended? How many lives derailed? Because someone could not wait, could not pause, could not insert even 5 seconds between feeling and action. You know this from your own life. You've sent the text message you regretted before your finger left the screen. You've spoken words you wanted to pull back into your mouth the instant they left it. You've made decisions in the heat of emotion that you spent months or years trying to undo. The Stoics called this the first movement, the protos hormi, the initial impulse that arises unbidden. You cannot control this. It arrives like weather, like a wave hitting shore. Someone insults you, and anger flares. Someone threatens you, and fear spikes. Someone attracts you, and desire ignites. These first movements are not failures. They are not weakness. They are simply human. But what happens next, the second movement, this is entirely within your control. And this is where mastery lives. The untrained person moves immediately from impulse to action. Feel anger, speak anger, feel desire, pursue desire, feel fear, flee or fight. There is no gap, no space, no consciousness between stimulus and response. They are reactive beings, pushed and pulled by every external event, slaves to whatever emotion happens to arise. The Stoic learns to pause, not forever, not in a way that paralyzes or prevents necessary action, but long enough to ask, is this the response I want? Is this who I want to be in this moment? Will this action taken from this emotional state, improve the situation or make it worse. Marcus Aurelius, governing an empire, facing constant decisions that affected millions of lives, wrote in his private journal, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." He was reminding himself daily that the source of his power was not his legions or his wealth or his political position. It was his capacity to pause, to reflect, to choose his response, rather than merely react to circumstances. Imagine if he hadn't practiced this. Imagine an emperor who reacted immediately to every provocation, every threat, every insult from senators or generals or foreign kings. Rome would have been bathed in blood. War would have followed war. The empire would have consumed itself. Instead, Marcus paused. He considered. He responded with measured intention rather than reflexive emotion. This is the first victory, and it's available to you right now in whatever situation you're facing. The colleague who takes credit for your work, the partner who says something hurtful, the stranger on the internet who attacks your opinion, the traffic that makes you late, the weather that ruins your plans, the diagnosis that changes everything. In each of these moments, there is an initial surge of emotion. This is the first movement. You cannot prevent it, but you can prevent yourself from being carried away by it. The practice is simple but not easy. When you feel strong emotion arising, name it. I'm feeling anger. I'm feeling fear. I'm feeling overwhelmed. This act of naming creates instant distance. You are no longer angry. You are experiencing anger. This seems like a subtle difference, but it's the difference between being the storm and watching the storm. Then ask, what is this emotion trying to protect? What does it want? Usually you'll find that the emotion has good intentions but outdated strategies. Your anger wants to protect your dignity, but destroying someone else won't actually restore it. Your fear wants to keep you safe, but avoiding everything uncomfortable will shrink your life to nothing. Your grief wants to honor what you've lost, but drowning in it won't bring it back. Understanding the emotion's purpose allows you to meet its need in a wiser way. Finally, ask, what response would I be proud of tomorrow? What action aligns with who I want to be, not just what I'm feeling right now? This is the crucial question, because the first victory is not about feeling nothing. It's about choosing your actions based on your values rather than your immediate emotional state. Epictetus taught his students a powerful exercise. When something upsetting happened, a broken cup, a harsh word, a disappointment, they were to immediately say to themselves, "This is nothing to me." Not because the event didn't matter, but because the event itself held no inherent power over their inner state. The broken cup is just a cup. The harsh word is just sound waves. The disappointment is just the gap between expectation and reality. What gives these events power is the story we tell about them, the meaning we assign, the judgment we render. Someone cuts you off in traffic. The first movement is a surge of anger, perhaps fear. This is automatic, biological, unavoidable, but what happens next is up to you. The untrained mind immediately constructs a narrative. That person is an asshole. They did that on purpose. They disrespected me. They could have caused an accident. People like that shouldn't be allowed to drive. And now you're not just dealing with a car changing lanes, you're dealing with a full story about disrespect, injustice, danger, and the moral failings of humanity. Your blood pressure rises, your jaw clenches, you might honk, gesture, accelerate aggressively. You'll probably still be angry about it hours later, telling the story to anyone who will listen. But what actually happened? A car changed lanes. That's it. Everything else, all the suffering, all the rage, you added. The Stoic, feeling that same initial surge of anger, pauses, observes the emotion, names it, then asks, "Do I know why that person changed lanes? Could there be an emergency? Could they be lost, distracted by terrible news, rushing to the hospital? Or are they simply a poor driver, acting from ignorance rather than malice?" And then, the most important question: will my anger change anything? Will it improve my day? Will it make me safer? Or will it only poison the next hour of my life, affecting my mood when I arrive at work, coloring my interactions with people who had nothing to do with this? In that pause, in that questioning, the anger loses its grip. It's still there, but it's no longer in control, and you can choose, respond with compassion, or at least with indifference rather than rage. This is the first victory, not the elimination of emotion, but the refusal to be ruled by it. Seneca wrote about a friend who had been insulted at a dinner party. The friend was furious, spending hours dissecting the insult, planning revenge, rehearsing confrontations. Seneca asked him a simple question: what if the person who insulted you is a fool? Then why do you care about a fool's opinion? And if they're wise, perhaps they saw something true that you need to hear. Either way, your anger serves no purpose. This is the Stoic method. Not denial, not suppression, but relentless questioning of our immediate reactions until we see them clearly for what they are, often irrational, almost always counterproductive, and completely within our power to transcend. The first victory creates a foundation for every victory that follows. Because once you can pause before reacting, once you can observe your emotions without being consumed by them, once you can choose your response based on wisdom rather than impulse, you become fundamentally unshakable. People can insult you, but you decide whether to be insulted. Circumstances can be difficult, but you decide whether to be defeated. Life can be unfair, but you decide whether to become bitter. This doesn't mean you won't feel pain. The Stoics felt pain. Marcus Aurelius buried children. Seneca faced exile and eventual execution. Epictetus lived with a crippled leg and the trauma of slavery. They felt grief, fear, anger, disappointment, all of it. But they didn't let these feelings make decisions for them. They didn't allow temporary emotions to dictate permanent actions. They didn't surrender their inner freedom to external circumstances. And this is what made them unconquerable. Think about the last argument you had that spiraled out of control. Somewhere near the beginning, there was a moment, brief, almost imperceptible, where you could have chosen differently. You could have paused. You could have asked a question instead of making an accusation. You could have acknowledged your own role instead of blaming. You could have said, "I need a moment," instead of escalating. That moment was your first victory, waiting to be claimed. You missed it that time. But it will come again. It comes every day, multiple times, in small situations and large ones. The practice is to catch it, to recognize the space between what happens and how you respond, to inhabit that space consciously, intentionally, powerfully. At first, you'll miss it more often than you catch it. The emotion will be too fast, too strong, too overwhelming. You'll react, and only later realize you had a choice. This is normal. This is part of the training. But gradually, the pause becomes easier. The space becomes wider. You start to catch yourself mid-reaction and course correct. Then you start to catch yourself before reacting. And eventually, the pause becomes automatic, not in the sense that you become slow or hesitant, but in the sense that wisdom becomes your default response rather than emotion. This is what the Stoics meant by living in accordance with nature, not the nature of impulse and instinct, but the higher nature of reason and virtue. The nature of a being who can observe themselves, question their own reactions, and choose to be better than their first impulse. Seneca's letters are filled with this theme because he struggled with it himself. He was wealthy, ambitious, involved in politics, all things that generated constant emotional turbulence. He knew what it was like to feel rage, envy, fear, desire. He wasn't writing from a position of having transcended these emotions. He was writing from the trenches, reminding himself daily of what he knew intellectually, but had to relearn emotionally, over and over. We are more often frightened than hurt, he wrote, and we suffer more in imagination than in reality. The first victory is recognizing this, seeing that most of our suffering is self-inflicted, added by our own judgments and reactions, rather than inherent in the events themselves. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. You start to notice how much of your day is spent in reaction, how much energy you pour into resenting things you cannot change, how much peace you sacrifice to defend ego positions that don't actually matter, how much of your life you've given away to anger, anxiety, and endless mental arguments with people who aren't even present. And you realize this is optional, all of it. The reaction, the resentment, the suffering, not the pain. Pain is inevitable, but the suffering we add to pain through our resistance and our stories and our refusal to accept what is. This realization is itself a victory, and from this victory, everything else becomes possible. You become someone people cannot argue with, not because you won't engage, but because you engage from a place of calm rather than reactivity. You listen instead of waiting to speak. You seek to understand instead of to win. You can be disagreed with without being disturbed. You can be insulted without retaliating. You can be wrong without your identity shattering. This is the person the Stoics were training to create. Not a stone statue, not an emotionless robot, not someone who doesn't care, but someone who cares deeply while remaining unshaken. Someone who feels fully while thinking clearly. Someone who can face anything because they've learned to face themselves first. The first victory is over the impulse to react. Every victory after that is just practice. And the practice never ends because the opportunities never stop coming. Every difficult person, every frustrating situation, every moment of fear or anger or disappointment is another chance to pause, to observe, to choose. This is not a burden. This is freedom. This is the path the Stoics walked, the path that led slaves to wisdom and emperors to humility, the path that has guided countless people through war, exile, loss, and death with their dignity intact and their peace unbroken. The path begins with a pause. The path begins now. The path begins with you in this moment, recognizing that between what happens to you and your response to it lies a space, and in that space lies all the difference. Claim it, master it, and you will have won the first victory, the one that makes all others possible. Reality is not what happens to you. Reality is what you make of what happens to you. This is perhaps the most radical idea the Stoics ever offered, and it remains radical today. We live in a world that insists circumstances determine outcomes, that events have inherent meaning, that what happens to us defines who we become. The Stoics rejected this entirely. Epictetus said it plainly. It's not things that disturb us, but our judgments about them. Read that again. Let it sink in. He's saying that the event itself, the betrayal, the loss, the failure, the diagnosis, is neutral. It's just what is. What disturbs you, what ruins your peace, what destroys your equilibrium is not the thing itself, but what you think about the thing. This seems impossible at first. Surely some things are objectively bad. Surely losing a loved one, being betrayed by someone you trusted, facing serious illness, surely these things are inherently disturbing. The Stoics would say, feel the grief, the anger, the fear. These are natural human responses. But then look deeper. What specifically is disturbing you? Is it the event, or is it your interpretation of what the event means about you, about the world, about your future? Modern psychology has rediscovered this ancient wisdom and given it new names. Cognitive reframing, cognitive restructuring. The fundamental premise of cognitive behavioral therapy is essentially Stoic philosophy in clinical dress. Change your thoughts, change your experience. Aaron Beck, working with depressed patients in the 1960s, noticed something remarkable. His patients weren't depressed because of their circumstances, at least not directly. They were depressed because of how they interpreted their circumstances. They filtered everything through distorted thinking patterns, all or nothing thinking, catastrophizing, personalization, mental filtering. Someone would make a single mistake and conclude, I'm a complete failure. One person would reject them and they'd think, nobody will ever love me. One setback would mean everything is ruined. Beck taught them to question these automatic thoughts, to examine the evidence, to consider alternative interpretations, to test whether their thoughts reflected reality or merely their habitual patterns of perception. This is Stoicism. This is what Marcus Aurelius did every morning when he wrote in his journal, challenging his own perceptions, reminding himself that things are rarely as bad as they first appear. Consider betrayal. Someone you trusted has deceived you, used you, revealed themselves to be different than you believed. The initial pain is real, unavoidable, human, but what happens next is entirely up to you. One perception: I've been destroyed. I can never trust anyone again. This proves that people are fundamentally selfish and cruel. I'm a fool for having trusted. My life is ruined. Another perception: I've received valuable information. This person has shown me who they are, and now I know. I'm disappointed, but I'm not destroyed. I can choose whether to continue this relationship or not, but either way, my core self remains intact. This experience will make me wiser, not bitter. Same event. Radically different experiences of that event. And the difference lies entirely in perception. The Stoics trained themselves to actively reframe situations, to deliberately choose interpretations that served their well-being and their virtue, rather than their ego and their fear. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Choose not to be harmed, and you won't feel harmed. Don't feel harmed, and you haven't been." This sounds like denial until you understand what he means. He's not saying pretend the event didn't happen. He's saying you get to decide what it means. You can frame being fired as a catastrophe that proves your worthlessness, or as liberation from a situation that wasn't serving you and an opportunity to find something better. You can frame illness as cruel injustice, or as a teacher about what truly matters. You can frame aging as decay and loss, or as the privilege of accumulated wisdom and the natural rhythm of existence. Neither interpretation is objectively true. Both are stories, but one story will destroy you and the other will sustain you. This is perception as a weapon, not against others, but against suffering itself. Mindfulness practice, which has become popular in recent decades, is essentially training in Stoic perception. When you practice mindfulness, you learn to observe your thoughts without believing them automatically. You learn to notice, I'm having the thought that I'm worthless, rather than simply concluding, I'm worthless. This creates space, distance, the ability to see thoughts as mental events rather than facts about reality. The Stoics did this 2,000 years before brain scans and clinical trials confirmed it works. They did it through philosophical reflection, through daily practice, through constant vigilance over their own perceptions. Seneca wrote about receiving insults. He said you can choose to be insulted or not. If someone calls you something you're not, why would you be disturbed? They're simply wrong. If they call you something you are, why be disturbed? They're simply observant. Either way, the insult has no power except what you grant it. This seems cold until you realize what he's actually saying. Your peace is too valuable to be held hostage by other people's opinions. Your sense of self is too important to be determined by external validation or criticism. Consider a personal betrayal transformed through perception. You discover that a colleague has been undermining you, taking credit for your work, spreading rumors to advance their own career at your expense. The initial response is rage, hurt, a sense of violation. This is the first movement, and it's natural. But then you pause. You apply Stoic perception. What actually happened? Someone acted out of their own insecurity, their own fear, their own misguided attempt to feel significant. They revealed their character, not yours. They damaged their own integrity, not yours. Can you control their behavior? Number. Can you control whether you work with them? Perhaps. Can you control how this affects your inner state? Absolutely. You can choose to see this as evidence that the world is cruel and people are untrustworthy. Or you can see it as information about one specific person, making you wiser about whom to trust, while leaving your fundamental faith in humanity intact. You can choose to spend months obsessing about revenge, poisoning yourself with resentment. Or you can extract the lesson, make whatever practical changes are necessary, and move forward unburdened. You can choose to let this person occupy space in your mind, shaping your mood, affecting your health, ruining your days. Or you can recognize that they're simply someone acting from ignorance and pain, and you can feel a kind of pity mixed with firm boundaries. Same event, but through conscious perception, you've transformed it from a trauma into a teaching, from a wound into wisdom. This is not positive thinking. The Stoics weren't optimists. They were realists who understood that reality itself is less important than how we perceive reality. They practiced what they called turning the obstacle upside down, finding the opportunity in every difficulty, the advantage in every setback, the lesson in every failure. Marcus Aurelius, facing an empire beset by plague and war, wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." He meant that obstacles are not just challenges to overcome, but opportunities to practice virtue. The difficult person teaches you patience. The unfair situation teaches you justice and equanimity. The loss teaches you about what truly matters. The fear teaches you courage. But none of this happens automatically. It happens through conscious, deliberate reframing of perception. Modern neuroscience confirms what the Stoics knew. The brain is plastic. Neural pathways strengthen with use. If you habitually perceive setbacks as catastrophes, you're strengthening catastrophic thinking patterns. If you habitually perceive challenges as opportunities, you're strengthening resilient thinking patterns. You are, quite literally, training your brain with every interpretation you make. The Stoics understood this intuitively. They knew that perception was not just passive reception of reality, but active construction of meaning. And they knew that mastering perception was the key to mastering life itself. This is why perception is a weapon. Not a weapon against other people, but against the suffering we inflict on ourselves through distorted, unconsidered, habitual ways of seeing. When someone insults you and you choose not to be insulted, you've disarmed them completely. Not because you've defended yourself, but because you've refused to fight on their terms. You've recognized that their words only have the power you give them. When circumstances turn against you and you refuse to catastrophize, you've transformed potential trauma into mere difficulty. You've maintained your equilibrium, your clarity, your ability to respond effectively rather than react desperately. When loss comes, and loss always comes, and you choose to see it as the natural rhythm of existence rather than cosmic injustice, you've found a way to grieve without being destroyed, to feel pain without becoming pain. This is Stoic perception. This is the forge where clarity is created. Every day, every moment, you're choosing how to perceive what's happening. Most people make these choices unconsciously, automatically, based on conditioning and habit and fear. The Stoic makes them consciously, deliberately, based on wisdom and virtue and the determination to remain unshaken. Epictetus taught his students to immediately reframe every difficulty. This is an opportunity to practice patience. This is a chance to demonstrate courage. This is how I learn what I'm capable of. Not denial. Not pretending things are other than they are, but choosing an interpretation that serves growth rather than one that serves suffering. The untrained mind sees a problem and feels defeated. The Stoic mind sees a problem and feels interested. What will this teach me? How will this strengthen me? Who will I become through facing this? Same reality, completely different experience of that reality. And here's what's remarkable. Over time, this practice changes not just how you experience events, but how events actually unfold. Because perception shapes behavior, and behavior shapes outcomes. If you perceive a setback as catastrophic, you'll respond with panic, poor judgment, desperate actions that often make things worse. If you perceive the same setback as a temporary difficulty requiring clear thinking, you'll respond with calm problem-solving that often resolves the situation. The Stoics understood that perception is not separate from reality. It shapes reality, not in a magical way, but in a profoundly practical one. This is why Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and Epictetus all emphasized the same practice. Constant vigilance over your perceptions. Question every automatic interpretation. Challenge every habitual judgment. Ask always, is this true? Is this useful? Is this the only way to see this? Perception is a weapon. Learn to wield it, and you become unconquerable. Not because nothing bad will happen to you, but because you will have learned to meet whatever happens with clarity, courage, and wisdom. And once you can do that, what is there left to fear? We are haunted by what we want. Every craving is a chain. Every "if only I had that" is a postponement of peace. Every "I'll be happy when" is a promise we make to ourselves that we rarely keep, because the target keeps moving, the goalpost shifts, the desire regenerates itself the moment it's satisfied. The Stoics understood something that cuts against everything modern culture teaches. Desire itself is the problem, not the failure to satisfy desire. This requires careful unpacking, because it sounds like the Stoics were advocating for a joyless, ascetic life of deprivation. They weren't. What they were saying is infinitely more subtle and more radical. Epictetus divided all things into two categories: things we control and things we don't. We've discussed this, but nested within this teaching is something deeper, a discipline of desire that goes to the root of human suffering. He said, "Desire only what is within your control. Everything else is a setup for disappointment, frustration, and slavery." Most people desire wealth, but wealth depends on markets, luck, other people's decisions, things outside your control. So you've set yourself up to be perpetually anxious, perpetually feeling insufficient, perpetually at the mercy of circumstances. Most people desire recognition, but recognition depends on others' opinions, which you cannot control. So you've made your peace hostage to the judgments of people who may be fickle, ignorant, or indifferent. Most people desire love from a specific person, but another person's feelings are outside your control, so you've guaranteed your own suffering because you're depending on something you cannot guarantee. The Stoic solution is not to desire nothing, it's to redirect desire toward what you actually control: your character, your effort, your intention, your response. Desire to be honest, that's within your control. Desire to be courageous, that's yours to command. Desire to treat others with respect, you can do that regardless of how they treat you. Desire to live according to your values, nothing can stop you except your own choices. This is the discipline of desire. And it's the hardest discipline the Stoics taught, because it requires abandoning the very things most people spend their entire lives chasing. Epicurus, the philosopher often mistakenly associated with hedonism, actually taught something surprisingly similar. He divided desires into three categories: natural and necessary, food, shelter, friendship; natural but unnecessary, gourmet food, luxurious shelter; and neither natural nor necessary, fame, power, excessive wealth. He taught that the first category should be satisfied simply. The second category should be enjoyed moderately when available but not pursued anxiously. And the third category should be abandoned entirely because it leads only to endless craving and inevitable disappointment. The Stoics went further. They said even the natural and necessary desires should be held lightly. Yes, desire food when hungry, but be prepared to go without. Yes, desire shelter, but be ready to lose it. Yes, desire friendship, but understand that all relationships end eventually, through distance, change, or death. This sounds grim until you realize what it actually creates: freedom. If your happiness depends on having things, you're forever vulnerable to loss. If your peace depends on circumstances being a certain way, you're forever at war with reality. If your sense of self depends on external validation, you're forever a slave to other people's opinions. But if you can want things without needing them, enjoy things without clinging to them, appreciate things without depending on them, then nothing can touch you, nothing can control you, nothing can take your peace. Viktor Frankl, imprisoned in Auschwitz, watching people die daily from starvation, disease, and execution, discovered this truth in its most extreme form. He noticed that survival didn't correlate with physical strength or youth or health. It correlated with meaning. Those who had something to live for, a person to see again, a work to complete, a purpose to fulfill, they were more likely to survive. Not because meaning prevented death, but because meaning prevented the kind of psychological collapse that hastened death. Frankl realized that the Nazis could take everything: his family, his possessions, his profession, his name, his body. But they could not take his inner freedom, his ability to choose his attitude, to find meaning even in suffering, to decide what this experience would make of him rather than merely what it would do to him. This is the discipline of desire in its purest form, desiring only what cannot be taken, desiring character over circumstance, desiring meaning over comfort, desiring integrity over survival itself. The existentialists, particularly Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus, arrived at similar conclusions from a different starting point. Camus wrote about Sisyphus, condemned by the gods to roll a boulder up a mountain for eternity, only to watch it roll back down, then to start again. Camus asked, "Is this not the perfect image of human existence? We struggle, we build, we achieve, and then it all comes undone. We age, we die, everything we create eventually crumbles. So what's the point?" His answer: one must imagine Sisyphus happy. Happy, condemned to eternal futile labor, yes, because Sisyphus can choose his attitude toward his fate. He can push the boulder with dignity, with defiance, with acceptance. He can find meaning not in the outcome, but in the action itself, in the integrity of the effort. This is the discipline of desire transformed into the acceptance of absurdity. We cannot control outcomes. We cannot guarantee success. We cannot prevent suffering or loss or death, but we can control how we meet these inevitabilities. The Stoics practiced specific exercises to discipline desire. They practiced voluntary discomfort, sleeping on the floor occasionally, eating simple food, enduring cold or heat, not to suffer, but to prove to themselves that they could be content with less, to remove the fear of deprivation that makes desire so desperate and clinging. Marcus Aurelius, the richest man in the world, reminded himself daily that all his possessions were borrowed, temporary, ultimately meaningless. He practiced imagining losing everything, not to depress himself, but to liberate himself from the anxiety of protecting what could not be protected. Seneca, incredibly wealthy, periodically lived as if he were poor, eating like a slave, dressing simply, giving away comforts. He wanted to know that if he lost everything tomorrow, he would be fine. And in knowing that, he freed himself to enjoy his wealth without being enslaved by it. This is the paradox. The less you need things, the more you can enjoy them. The less you cling to people, the more genuinely you can love them. The less you depend on circumstances being a certain way, the more peace you find in any circumstance. Modern consumer culture teaches the opposite. It teaches that happiness comes from acquiring, from upgrading, from having more and better and newer. It teaches that you're insufficient as you are, that fulfillment is always one purchase away, that the solution to desire is satisfaction. But satisfaction never comes. Or it comes for a moment and then evaporates, leaving the same emptiness it promised to fill, now demanding to be filled again. This is what the Buddha called dukkha, suffering, but more accurately translated as unsatisfactoriness. The quality of always wanting more, of never quite arriving, of happiness always deferred to the next achievement, the next acquisition, the next experience. The Stoics saw this clearly. They saw that desire is inherently painful because it's rooted in lack. To desire something is to believe you're incomplete without it, and that belief itself is suffering. The discipline of desire doesn't mean becoming desireless. It means transforming the quality of desire from craving to preference, from need to appreciation, from desperation to equanimity. You can prefer comfort while being content in discomfort. You can appreciate success while accepting failure. You can love deeply while understanding impermanence. You can want things to go well while remaining peaceful when they don't. This is mastery. This is freedom. This is what the Stoics meant when they talked about living in accordance with nature, accepting the way things actually are rather than demanding they be different. The discipline of desire is perhaps the most countercultural teaching in Stoicism. Everything in modern life pulls you in the opposite direction. Advertising, social media, cultural narratives of success. All of it teaches you to want more, to never be satisfied, to always be striving for the next thing. And all of it guarantees unhappiness, because the mechanism is designed to be unsatisfiable. As soon as one desire is met, another arises. The new car becomes ordinary within months. The promotion you worked years for becomes your new baseline within weeks. The relationship you longed for reveals itself to be just as complicated as being alone. This isn't pessimism, it's realism. And in seeing it clearly, the Stoics found a way out. Not through satisfying desire, but through transforming it. Through wanting only what you already have, or what is completely within your power to create or sustain. When Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Very little is needed to make a happy life. It is all within yourself, in your way of thinking," he was offering a path to liberation that most people never find because they're looking in the wrong direction. They're looking outward toward acquisition and achievement and validation. The Stoics looked inward toward character and wisdom and the quality of consciousness itself. And in that inward turn, they found something that external circumstances could never provide and could never take away. Peace that doesn't depend on anything outside themselves. This is the discipline of desire, and it is the foundation of unshakable freedom. The world tells you that freedom is the absence of limits. The Stoics knew that freedom is found within limits. This is perhaps the most counterintuitive teaching in all of philosophy, and also one of the most empirically verifiable. Every moment of your life proves it true, yet most people spend their entire existence fighting against it. We believe that if we could just do whatever we wanted whenever we wanted, we'd be free. No schedules, no obligations, no restraints on our appetites or impulses, pure spontaneity, pure indulgence, pure self-expression. This is not freedom. This is slavery to every passing desire, every momentary impulse, every conditioned craving that arises in consciousness. The person who eats whatever they want, whenever they want, becomes slave to their appetite and eventually to their deteriorating health. The person who speaks every thought that enters their mind becomes slave to their impulses and alienates everyone around them. The person who pursues every attraction becomes slave to desire and incapable of sustained intimacy. True freedom, the kind the Stoics practiced and the kind that actually produces peace, is the freedom that comes from self-command, from choosing your responses rather than being driven by reactions, from directing your life according to principles rather than being blown about by circumstances and feelings. Marcus Aurelius, who commanded the most powerful military in the world and could have indulged any appetite, practiced restraint as spiritual discipline. He could have lived in decadence. Instead, he lived simply, governed wisely, and reminded himself daily that power was a responsibility, not a license for self-gratification. "You have power over your mind," he wrote, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. The strength he's describing is not the strength to dominate others or circumstances. It's the strength of self-governance, the strength to say no to yourself, the strength to delay gratification, to endure discomfort, to choose the hard right over the easy wrong. Modern psychology has extensively studied delayed gratification, most famously in the Stanford marshmallow experiment. Children were offered one marshmallow immediately or two marshmallows if they could wait 15 minutes. The researchers then followed these children for decades. The results were striking. The children who could delay gratification had better life outcomes across virtually every metric. Higher academic achievement, better health, more stable relationships, higher income, lower rates of addiction and incarceration. Why? Because the ability to delay gratification is the foundation of every other life skill. It's the ability to choose long-term benefit over short-term pleasure, to endure temporary discomfort for lasting gain, to govern your impulses rather than be governed by them. This is what the Stoics practiced every day. They called it self-restraint, temperance, sophrosyne. But it wasn't about deprivation or punishment. It was about freedom. Because here's the paradox. Every time you give in to an impulse, you know you'll regret. You've diminished your freedom. You've proven to yourself that you cannot be trusted, that you're at the mercy of whatever you're feeling in the moment. You've reinforced the neural pathways of impulsivity and weakened the pathways of self-control. But every time you choose restraint, every time you feel the urge to react angrily and pause instead, every time you want to quit and persist instead, every time you desire instant gratification and wait instead, you're building freedom. You're training yourself to be the author of your life rather than a character in a story you didn't write. Viktor Frankl's experience illustrates this at the most extreme level imaginable. In the concentration camps, prisoners lost control over everything: their movement, their food, their daily activities, even their thoughts to some degree, as starvation and exhaustion made clear thinking nearly impossible. Yet Frankl observed that even there, in that hell, some freedom remained. The freedom to choose one's attitude, the freedom to help a fellow prisoner even when you were barely surviving yourself, the freedom to maintain dignity even when everything else had been stripped away. He wrote about prisoners who walked through the camps comforting others, giving away their last piece of bread, maintaining their humanity when it would have been easier to become animal. These people, he said, proved that everything can be taken from a person except the last human freedom: to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. This is not merely inspirational rhetoric. This is the core truth about human freedom. It exists only in the space between stimulus and response. In that gap, in that pause, in that moment of choice, that's where freedom lives. And that freedom is either exercised or surrendered in every moment. The Stoics understood that freedom doesn't mean the absence of constraints. We are constrained by our bodies, by physics, by social reality, by circumstances beyond our control. These constraints are not optional. They are the conditions of existence. Real freedom is found in how we respond to constraints. Do we rage against them uselessly? Do we use them as excuses for not becoming who we could be? Or do we recognize them as the boundaries within which our agency operates, the frame within which we paint our lives? Epictetus, who experienced physical slavery and knew constraint intimately, taught that the only thing that could actually enslave him was his own unchecked desires and aversions. If he desired what he didn't have, he was enslaved to that desire. If he avoided what he couldn't avoid, he was enslaved to that aversion. But if he wanted only what was within his power to want, virtue, good character, right action, then he was free. If he accepted what he couldn't change, he was free. No external circumstance could touch that freedom. This is the freedom the Stoics meant. Not freedom from difficulty, but freedom within difficulty. Not freedom from limitation, but freedom through understanding what's actually within your control. And what's within your control is smaller than you think, but more powerful than you imagine. You control your attention, where you place it, what you focus on, how long you dwell on any given thought or feeling. You control your interpretation, what you make of what happens, what meaning you assign, what story you tell yourself about events. You control your response, not your initial emotional reaction, but what you do with that reaction. Whether you act on it, examine it, or let it pass. You control your effort. Whether you try, how hard you try, whether you persist through difficulty, you control your intention. Why you do, what values guide your choices, what kind of person you're becoming through your actions. That's it. That's your kingdom. And it's enough. Because once you fully govern that small kingdom, once you have true mastery over your attention, interpretation, response, effort, and intention, you become unconquerable. People can insult you, but they cannot make you feel insulted. Circumstances can be difficult, but they cannot make you despair. Loss can come, but it cannot destroy your fundamental integrity. Even death can approach, but it cannot take your freedom to face it with dignity. This is what restraint creates. Not a smaller life, but a freer one. Not fewer possibilities, but clearer choices. Not less power, but power properly directed. Modern emotional regulation research confirms what the Stoics knew. The ability to modulate your emotional responses, to feel them fully without being controlled by them, is perhaps the most important predictor of well-being, relationship quality, professional success, and overall life satisfaction. This ability is not innate. It's trained. And it's trained through restraint. Through choosing again and again not to act on every feeling, through sitting with discomfort instead of immediately reaching for distraction or comfort, through feeling the urge and not obeying it automatically. Each act of restraint is a repetition in the gym of self-mastery. You're building strength, you're creating freedom, you're proving to yourself that you are not at the mercy of impulse, that you can direct your life, that you are capable of being the person you want to be, even when it's difficult. The Stoics practiced this daily. They practiced hunger to know they could endure it. They practiced discomfort to prove they weren't dependent on comfort. They practiced saying no to themselves so they could be trusted to say yes to their principles. This wasn't masochism. It was training. The same way an athlete trains their body to perform under stress, the Stoics trained their minds to remain steady under any circumstance. And here's what they discovered. The more you practice restraint, the less restraint feels like restraint. It becomes natural, automatic, simply who you are. The first time you resist an impulse, it's hard. The 50th time, it's easier. The 500th time, you barely notice. You've retrained yourself. You've rewritten the script of your automatic responses. This is the forge where character is created. Not in grand gestures or extraordinary moments, but in small daily choices. The choice to wake when the alarm sounds. The choice to do the work you committed to doing. The choice to keep your word even when it's inconvenient. The choice to speak truthfully even when lying would be easier. Each small act of restraint is a brick in the fortress of your character. Each small act of self-governance is a declaration of independence from impulse, from circumstance, from the tyranny of feeling. This is the paradox. Freedom increases in proportion to restraint. The more you can govern yourself, the less you need to be governed by anything else. The more you can direct your own behavior, the less you're at the mercy of external circumstances. This is why Marcus Aurelius, at the height of power, practiced philosophy. This is why Seneca, surrounded by wealth, practiced simplicity. This is why Epictetus, having gained physical freedom, continued to practice mental discipline. They understood that external freedom is incomplete without internal freedom. And internal freedom comes only through restraint, through the daily practice of self-governance, of choosing the difficult right over the easy wrong, of building the kind of character that cannot be shaken because it has been forged in the fire of deliberate discipline. This is freedom in restraint. This is the paradox at the heart of Stoicism. This is the path to becoming truly unconquerable. Not because nothing can touch you, but because you have learned to govern yourself so completely that nothing can control you. And that is the only freedom that actually matters. Peace is not found, it is built. Brick by brick, habit by habit, choice by choice. It is architecture, not accident. Engineering, not luck. The deliberate construction of an internal fortress that can weather any storm, withstand any siege, remain standing when everything else has fallen. The Stoics understood this completely. They didn't wait for peace to descend upon them like grace. They created the conditions for peace through systematic practice, through daily disciplines that trained the mind the way an athlete trains the body. Marcus Aurelius kept a journal. Every day, often in the morning before facing the chaos of governing an empire, or in the evening after battle, he wrote, not for publication, not for posterity, but for himself. He wrote reminders of first principles. He wrote to realign himself with his values. He wrote to process his thoughts and emotions, to examine his reactions, to question his perceptions. This practice, journaling, reflection, what the Stoics called the examination of consciousness, is not incidental to their philosophy. It is central. Because peace requires self-knowledge, and self-knowledge requires conscious examination of the contents of your mind. Without this practice, you operate on autopilot. Thoughts arise and you believe them. Emotions surface and you act on them. Patterns repeat and you don't even notice. You are, in a sense, asleep in your own life, reacting rather than responding, driven rather than directing. Journaling creates a space for consciousness to examine itself. When you write, "I'm feeling anxious about tomorrow's meeting," you've already created distance from the anxiety. You're no longer simply anxious, you're observing anxiety, which means there's a part of you that is not the anxiety. This is what the Stoics meant by the ruling center, the hegemonikon, the command post of consciousness that can observe everything else, including thoughts and emotions, without being identical to them. Modern psychology calls this metacognition, thinking about thinking. And research consistently shows that people with higher metacognitive awareness have better emotional regulation, make better decisions, and experience less psychological distress. The Stoics practiced this metacognition through writing. They would describe what happened during the day, then examine their responses. Where did I react poorly? Where was I governed by emotion rather than reason? Where did I give away my peace? Where did I act with virtue? This isn't self-flagellation, it's self-correction. The way a pilot constantly makes small adjustments to stay on course, the Stoic constantly examines their own mind to stay aligned with their principles. Seneca wrote extensive letters to his friend Lucilius, and these letters served the same purpose. They forced him to articulate his philosophy, to apply Stoic principles to concrete situations, to think through ethical dilemmas and practical challenges. The act of writing clarified his thinking and reinforced his practice. This is one pillar of the architecture of inner peace: regular, honest self-examination through writing or systematic reflection. The second pillar is solitude. We live in an age of constant connectivity, perpetual distraction, endless noise. There is always another notification, another message, another piece of content demanding attention. The mind is never allowed to settle, never given space to simply be. The Stoics valued solitude not as escape, but as necessary maintenance. The mind needs silence, the way the body needs rest. Without it, clarity becomes impossible. Wisdom cannot emerge when consciousness is constantly reactive, constantly processing external stimuli, never turning inward. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "People seek retreats for themselves in the country, by the sea, in the mountains, but this is the mark of a lack of culture, for you can retreat into yourself whenever you wish." He's saying that solitude is not primarily about physical isolation. It's about internal withdrawal, the ability to step back from the chaos of external events and find stillness within yourself, regardless of where you are or what's happening around you. But this ability must be cultivated, and it's cultivated through actual practice of solitude, through time spent not consuming content, not interacting, not doing anything productive, just being, just sitting with your own consciousness, watching thoughts arise and pass, feeling emotions without immediately acting on them or distracting yourself from them. This is what meditation is, what contemplative prayer is, what long walks alone in nature accomplish. They create space for the mind to settle, for deeper truths to emerge, for the constant reactivity to quiet down enough that you can hear yourself think. The Stoics practiced this daily. They would set aside time, morning, evening, or both, for philosophical reflection. They would review their principles, examine their behavior, contemplate mortality and impermanence, remember what truly matters. This wasn't morbid. It was clarifying. Because in solitude, away from the social pressures and constant demands of daily life, you can see more clearly. You can distinguish between what matters and what doesn't, between what you control and what you don't, between who you're trying to be and who you're actually becoming. The third pillar is habit. Peace is not a state you achieve once and then maintain effortlessly. It's a practice you must return to again and again, ideally so consistently that it becomes automatic. Not in the sense of mindless, but in the sense of natural, integrated, simply who you are. The Stoics understood that character is the accumulation of habits. You are what you repeatedly do, not what you occasionally do when you're feeling inspired, but what you do consistently, day after day, especially when you don't feel like it. Aristotle, who influenced Stoic thinking, wrote that we become just by performing just acts, courageous by performing courageous acts, temperate by performing temperate acts. Virtue is not an abstract ideal. It's a set of practiced behaviors that become internalized through repetition. This is why the Stoics emphasize daily practice: morning meditation, setting intentions for the day, evening review of how the day went. Small practices done consistently that shape consciousness over time. Modern neuroscience confirms this. The brain changes in response to repeated behaviors. Neural pathways strengthen with use. If you repeatedly practice gratitude, your brain becomes more attuned to what's going right. If you repeatedly practice patience, your default response to frustration shifts. If you repeatedly examine your perceptions, you become naturally skeptical of your first interpretations. You are quite literally rewiring your brain through your habits. The Stoics created specific practices to build the habits that supported inner peace, premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. Each morning, they would imagine what could go wrong that day. Not to be pessimistic, but to be prepared. They would imagine difficult people, frustrating situations, things not going according to plan, and they would rehearse their response. If this happens, I will remain calm. I will remember that this is outside my control. I will respond with patience and wisdom. This practice inoculates you against the shock of difficulty. When the difficult thing happens, you've already faced it mentally. You've already decided how you'll respond. So instead of being thrown off balance, you simply execute what you've already rehearsed. Negative visualization, contemplating loss. They would imagine losing what they valued, their health, their wealth, their loved ones, their reputation, their life itself. Not to torture themselves, but to remember that everything is temporary, borrowed, not truly possessed. This practice creates gratitude for what you have now and prepares you for inevitable loss. When Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You could leave life right now," let that determine what you do and say and think. He was practicing negative visualization. Remembering mortality clarifies what matters. It cuts through trivial concerns and reveals what's actually important. Voluntary discomfort, deliberately choosing difficulty, sleeping on the floor occasionally, eating simple food, taking cold showers, going without something you've come to depend on. Not as punishment, but as training. To prove to yourself that you can be content with less. To remove the fear of deprivation that makes desire so desperate and clinging. Seneca would periodically live as if he were poor, eating like a slave, dressing simply. He wanted to know that if he lost everything tomorrow, he would survive. He would be fine. And in knowing that, he freed himself from the anxiety of protecting what could not be protected anyway. Memento mori, remember death. The Stoics kept death constantly in view, not as morbid obsession, but as clarifying truth. You will die. Everyone you love will die. Everything you build will eventually crumble. This is not pessimism. It's reality. And accepting this reality transforms how you live. When you remember that time is finite, you stop wasting it on trivial concerns. When you remember that everyone you meet could die tomorrow, you treat them with more kindness. When you remember that this could be your last day, you live it more intentionally. These practices, journaling, solitude, daily habit building, premeditation, negative visualization, voluntary discomfort, remembering death, these are the materials from which inner peace is constructed. Not through grand gestures or dramatic transformations, but through small, consistent practices that gradually reshape consciousness. Think of it like building a cathedral. No single stone matters much, but thousands of stones carefully placed, one on top of another, over years and decades, create something magnificent, something that stands for centuries, something that can't be knocked down by any storm. This is what the Stoics were doing with their daily practices, building a cathedral of consciousness, creating an internal architecture strong enough to weather anything. Modern mental health understanding increasingly recognizes what the Stoics knew. Sustained well-being comes from practice, not from circumstances. Cognitive behavioral therapy is essentially structured, Stoic practice, examining thoughts, questioning interpretations, deliberately choosing different responses. Mindfulness meditation is Stoic attention training. Gratitude practices are Stoic appreciation exercises. The therapeutic community has rediscovered what the Stoics taught. You can systematically train your mind toward peace, resilience, and clarity, not by waiting for the right circumstances, but by building the right habits. This is empowering because it means your peace doesn't depend on the world cooperating with your preferences. It doesn't depend on other people behaving the way you want. It doesn't depend on circumstances being easy or fair or pleasant. It depends only on your commitment to practice, on your willingness to show up every day and do the work of examining your mind, questioning your perceptions, choosing your responses, aligning your actions with your values. Some days the practice will feel profound. You'll have insights that shift your entire perspective. Other days it will feel mechanical, like you're just going through the motions. This is normal. The practice works whether you feel inspired or not. What matters is consistency. What matters is the accumulation of small efforts over time. What matters is that you show up, even when, especially when, you don't feel like it. Because those are the days when the practice matters most. When you're tired, stressed, overwhelmed, and you still pause to examine your thoughts, still choose your response consciously, still align your actions with your principles. That's when you're building real strength. That's when you're forging unshakable character. The architecture of inner peace is not built once. It's maintained daily. Some days you're adding new elements. Other days you're just maintaining what's already there. And sometimes storms come and damage part of the structure, and you have to rebuild. This is not failure. This is the nature of the practice. The Stoics knew they would never be perfect. Marcus Aurelius, after decades of philosophical practice, still wrote reminders to himself, still caught himself reacting poorly, still had to recenter himself. The goal is not perfection. The goal is practice. The goal is returning again and again to the work of examining consciousness, questioning perception, choosing virtue, building character. And over time, something remarkable happens. The practices become part of you. The questioning becomes automatic. The pause before reacting becomes natural. The peace becomes more stable, more resilient, less dependent on external conditions. You haven't eliminated difficulty from your life, but you've built a fortress within yourself that difficulty cannot breach. You've created an internal architecture strong enough to weather any storm. This is what the Stoics meant by the citadel of the soul. A place nothing external can touch. A refuge that exists not in any physical location, but in the disciplined, practiced, examined consciousness itself. You build it with daily practice. You maintain it with constant vigilance. You strengthen it with every conscious choice. And once built, it cannot be taken from you. Not by circumstance, not by other people, not by loss or failure or death itself. This is the architecture of inner peace, and it is the only peace that lasts. The first victory was recognizing you could pause. The second victory is when that pause becomes who you are. There comes a moment when the practice stops feeling like practice and starts feeling like nature. When the conscious effort to remain calm becomes simply being calm. When the deliberate choice to respond with wisdom becomes the automatic response. When the architecture you've been building becomes the ground you stand on without thinking about it. This is integration. This is mastery. This is the second victory. It doesn't announce itself. There's no ceremony, no clear before and after. You simply realize, perhaps in the middle of a situation that would have destroyed your peace months or years ago, that you're fine. Not because you're pretending, not because you're suppressing emotion, but because you genuinely are undisturbed. Someone insults you, and you feel a flicker of the old reactivity, but it passes like a cloud, leaving no trace. A plan falls apart, and you notice disappointment, but underneath it is a steady knowing that this changes nothing fundamental about who you are or what you're capable of. You're criticized, betrayed, overlooked, and while you feel these things, you're no longer consumed by them. This is what the Stoics work toward, not the elimination of emotion, but the transformation of your relationship with emotion, not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of unshakable equanimity within difficulty. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The mind that is free from passions is a citadel. Man has no stronger fortress in which to seek shelter and remain forever untaken. Foolish is the man who has not discovered this place." He discovered it. Through years of practice, through countless moments of pausing and questioning and choosing, he discovered that there was a place within himself that nothing could touch, and from that place he could meet anything. This is the second victory, and it is recognized not by you proclaiming it, but by others noticing something has shifted. Imagine this scene. You're in a meeting. Someone takes credit for your work. They present your ideas as their own, basking in the recognition that should have been yours. You feel the familiar heat of anger rising, the tightness in your chest, the mental rehearsal of how you'll confront them, expose them, reclaim what's yours. But then, and this is where the second victory lives, you pause. Not forcefully, not as a struggle, but naturally. And in that pause, you see clearly. This person is acting from insecurity. They believe that taking credit will make them valuable, when actually it's revealing their lack of integrity. They're harming themselves more than they're harming you. Your worth doesn't come from others' recognition. Your ideas were good because they were good, not because someone acknowledged them. You can choose to correct the record calmly or let it go entirely, depending on what wisdom suggests, not what ego demands. The anger is still there, but it's not driving. You're not suppressing it or fighting it. You're simply not identified with it. You feel it the way you feel the temperature of the room, real, present, but not defining of your experience. You speak, but when you speak, your voice is steady. Your words are measured. You're not attacking or defending. You're simply clarifying. Or perhaps you say nothing at all, recognizing that this moment matters far less than your peace does. And here's what's remarkable. People notice. The person who took credit expects confrontation. They're braced for your anger, ready to defend themselves or attack back. But you don't give them what they expect. Your calm disarms them. Your lack of reactivity creates confusion. They were ready for a fight, but you're not fighting. You're simply present, clear, unmoved. This is the power of the second victory. You've become someone who cannot be argued with because you're no longer arguing with yourself. Your internal civil war has ended, and without that war, there's nothing for external conflict to hook into. Others may still try to provoke you. They may raise their voices, make accusations, twist your words, but they're fighting air. You're not resisting them, which means there's nothing to push against. You're not defending yourself desperately, which means their attacks find no purchase. You can acknowledge their perspective without adopting it. You can hear their anger without becoming angry. You can recognize their pain without taking responsibility for it. You can stand firm in your boundaries without aggression. You can be completely present to what's happening without being swept away by it. This is what people mean when they say, "Nobody argues with someone who thinks like this." It's not that you refuse to engage. It's that you engage from a place so grounded, so clear, so unshakable that argument becomes impossible. There's no reactivity to fuel the fire. There's no ego desperately defending itself. There's just presence, clarity, and an almost tangible peace. Epictetus told his students, "If you wish to be free, desire nothing and no one which depends upon others, else you must necessarily be a slave." The second victory is realizing you've internalized this teaching. You still want things, good relationships, meaningful work, health, comfort, but you don't need them in the way you once did. Your fundamental okayness doesn't depend on having them. You can pursue them without clinging. You can lose them without being destroyed. This creates a kind of invulnerability. Not because nothing can hurt you, but because nothing can touch what's essential in you. The citadel Marcus Aurelius wrote about is fully built. The fortress stands, and from within it, you can face anything. Viktor Frankl emerged from the concentration camps with this quality. People who met him after described a man who radiated peace despite having endured hell. He could speak about the camps without bitterness, could analyze the psychology of suffering without being consumed by his own, could find meaning in the meaningless. This wasn't denial. He acknowledged the horror fully. But he had discovered something the horror couldn't take: his freedom to choose his response, his ability to find meaning, his fundamental human dignity. And having discovered it in the worst conditions imaginable, he knew it was unassailable. This is the second victory at its most profound, when you've tested your philosophy in fire and found it solid, when you've faced the worst and discovered that the worst cannot actually destroy what matters most. For most people, the test won't be as extreme as Frankl's, but the principle remains. The second victory is when the practice has transformed from something you do into something you are. You no longer think, "I should pause before reacting." You simply pause. You no longer remind yourself, "This is outside my control." You simply recognize it and release it. You no longer force yourself to choose the wise response. Wisdom has become your natural inclination. This doesn't mean you're perfect. The Stoics never claimed perfection. Marcus Aurelius, decades into his practice, still wrote daily reminders to himself, still caught himself reacting poorly, still had to recenter. But the center itself was solid, and returning to it was natural, not forced. Like a ship with a true keel that rights itself automatically after being tipped by waves. The second victory is subtle. Others may notice it before you do. They'll comment that you seem different, calmer, more present, less reactive. They may not be able to articulate exactly what's changed, but they feel it. The quality of your presence has shifted. You're no longer radiating the subtle anxiety of someone who needs the world to be a certain way. You're no longer emanating the tension of someone constantly defending their ego. You're not performing peace or faking calm. You've become it. And paradoxically, this is when you become most effective in the world. Not because you're trying harder, but because you're no longer fighting yourself. The energy that was consumed by internal conflict, by defending ego, by resisting reality, all of that energy is now available for actual action. You can focus completely on what needs to be done because you're not also managing your own reactivity. You can listen fully because you're not simultaneously rehearsing your response. You can be present to this moment because you're not lost in stories about what it means or what might happen next. This is the fruit of all the practice. The journaling, the solitude, the premeditation, the voluntary discomfort, the constant examination of perception. It all culminates here in a way of being that is simultaneously more natural and more disciplined than anything you've known before. The second victory is not the end of the path. The Stoics would say there is no end, only continued practice, deeper integration, more consistent alignment between principles and actions. But it is a threshold, a point of transformation where you recognize that the work has changed you fundamentally. You're no longer trying to be stoic. You're no longer attempting to practice equanimity. You simply are equanimous, in the way a tree simply is rooted, not through effort, but through nature, a nature you've cultivated so thoroughly that it has become nature itself. And from this place, you move through the world differently, lighter, freer, unshaken by what would once have destroyed your peace, present to both joy and sorrow without clinging to one or resisting the other, meeting each moment as it is, responding with wisdom, and then releasing it completely. This is the second victory, and it is yours, waiting in the practice, built day by day, choice by choice, pause by pause, until suddenly it's not something you're building anymore. It's simply who you've become. There is a power that doesn't announce itself, a strength that has nothing to prove, a wisdom that feels no need to convince anyone of anything. This is the power of the mature Stoic, and it is almost invisible because it operates on a frequency most people aren't tuned to receive. When you first discover Stoicism, there's often an evangelical impulse. You want to share it. You want everyone to understand what you've found. You see people suffering needlessly, reacting destructively, enslaved by their own emotions, and you want to help them see. You want to explain, to convince, to convert. This impulse is natural, but it is not wisdom. The mature Stoic has moved beyond the need to change anyone's mind, not because they don't care, but because they understand something deeper. Everyone is on their own path, learning their own lessons, at their own pace. Your clarity cannot be transferred through argument. Your peace cannot be installed in someone else through explanation. People don't change because you've given them the right information. They change when they're ready, when their own suffering has created enough opening for new understanding to enter, when their own experience has prepared the ground for seeds to take root. The mature Stoic knows this, so they don't push, they don't preach, they don't try to convince anyone of anything. They simply are. And in their being, in the quality of their presence, the steadiness of their responses, the peace that radiates from them without effort, they become a living demonstration of what's possible. Carl Jung wrote extensively about individuation, the process of becoming fully yourself, integrating all the disparate parts of your psyche into a coherent whole. This process, he said, was not about perfection, but about wholeness, not about eliminating the shadow, but about integrating it, not about transcending humanity, but about fully becoming human. The mature Stoic has undergone a similar process. They've integrated emotion and reason. They've made peace with their own contradictions. They've accepted their limitations while fully inhabiting their agency. They've stopped fighting themselves, and in that cessation of internal warfare, they've found a power that fighting could never produce. This is what Jung called the self, capital S, the integrated totality of consciousness, the center that holds everything together without strain. It's what the Stoics called the hegemonikon fully realized, the ruling center of consciousness fully established in its own nature. From this place, there is no need to prove anything. The mature Stoic doesn't need to demonstrate their equanimity because they're not performing it. They're embodying it. They don't need to win arguments because they're no longer arguing with reality. They don't need validation because their sense of worth comes from within, from alignment with their own principles, not from external recognition. This creates a presence that is both powerful and gentle, strong but not aggressive, clear but not harsh, certain but not rigid. People feel this. They may not be able to articulate what they're sensing, but they notice something different. The mature Stoic doesn't dominate a room through force of personality, but their presence affects the room nonetheless. Conversations become calmer around them. Conflicts de-escalate in their vicinity. People instinctively seek them out when they need clarity or perspective. Not because the Stoic is trying to have this effect, but because consciousness is contagious. Peace radiates. Agitation radiates. Whatever state you're in, you're broadcasting it constantly through subtle cues, through the quality of your attention, through the energy you bring to every interaction. The mature Stoic broadcasts stillness, and in a world of constant agitation, stillness is magnetic. Marcus Aurelius understood this. As emperor, he could have ruled through intimidation, through displays of power, through the constant assertion of dominance. Instead, he ruled through wisdom, through measured responses, through the kind of presence that made people want to be better versions of themselves. History records that his senators and generals respected him not because they feared him, but because they sensed something rare in him. A man who had power over himself and therefore needed less power over others. A man who was governed by principles rather than passions and therefore could govern justly. This is the quiet power, and it's available to anyone willing to do the work of integration, of honest self-examination, of daily practice toward wholeness. You stop needing to be right, so conflicts lose their urgency. You stop needing recognition, so criticism loses its sting. You stop needing control, so uncertainty becomes just another condition to navigate rather than a threat to resist. This doesn't make you passive. The mature Stoic acts when action is called for, speaks when speech is necessary, engages fully with life. But they do so from a place of choice rather than compulsion, from wisdom rather than reactivity, from love rather than fear. There's a quality of effortlessness to this, not because things are easy, but because there's no internal resistance burning energy uselessly. The river flows around the rock, not through tremendous effort, but through being water, through following its own nature without fighting. The mature Stoic has found their nature. They've discovered what the Stoics called living in accordance with nature, not the nature of impulse and animal instinct, but the higher nature of reason, virtue, wisdom, and love. The nature of a being who can observe itself, question its own perceptions, and choose its responses. And from this alignment with their own nature, everything becomes simpler. Not easier, but simpler, clearer, more direct. You see what needs to be done, and you do it, without the drama of internal conflict. You encounter difficulty, and you meet it, without the suffering of resistance. You face loss, and you grieve, without the added pain of believing it shouldn't have happened. This is transcendence, not in the sense of escaping the human condition, but in the sense of fully inhabiting it with consciousness, with acceptance, with grace. Jung described this as the transcendent function, the ability to hold opposites in consciousness without being torn apart by them. To feel emotion deeply while thinking clearly. To be vulnerable yet strong. to be certain of your principles while humble about your understanding, to be fully engaged with life while unattached to outcomes. The mature Stoic has cultivated this function through years of practice, through thousands of moments of pausing before reacting, through countless examinations of their own perceptions, through daily remembrances of what truly matters and what truly doesn't. And now, that cultivation has borne fruit. Not fruit they need to display or prove or protect, but fruit that simply nourishes everyone who comes into contact with it. This is the quiet power, and it is louder than any argument, stronger than any aggression, more convincing than any persuasion. Because it is real, not performed, not strategized, not calculated for effect. It is simply what emerges when a human being stops fighting themselves, stops resisting reality, stops defending an illusory self, and stands fully in the truth of who they actually are beneath all the conditioning and reactivity and fear. The mature Stoic has nothing to prove because they've already proven everything that matters. Not to the world, but to themselves. They know they can face difficulty. They know they can endure loss. They know they can be wrong and survive it. They know they can be criticized and remain intact. They know they can lose everything external and still have everything that matters. This knowing creates an unshakable foundation. And from that foundation, they engage with the world not as someone seeking validation or avoiding threats, but as someone who is fundamentally okay, regardless of what happens. This is the power everyone is actually seeking when they seek power. But most people look for it in the wrong places. In domination, in wealth, in recognition, in control over others and circumstances. The quiet power comes from the only source that can never be taken: mastery over yourself. Understanding of your own mind, alignment with your own values, integration of your own psyche. And once you have that, everything else is just details, important details perhaps, things to attend to and engage with, but details nonetheless, not the source of your worth, not the foundation of your peace, not the determinant of who you are. You are who you are in the stillness, in the space between thoughts, in the observer that watches everything arise and pass without clinging or resisting. And that cannot be argued with, cannot be defeated, cannot be taken. This is the quiet power, and it is the beginning of true transcendence. To become who you truly are, you must first die to who you think you are. This is perhaps the most terrifying and most liberating teaching in all of philosophy. The death of ego. Not the death of self, the death of the false self, the constructed identity, the story you've been telling yourself and defending and protecting and presenting to the world as if it were reality.
The Stoics practiced this death daily. They called it memento mori. Remember death. Not as morbid obsession, not as depression or nihilism, but as the most clarifying practice available to human consciousness.
When you remember that you will die, everything changes. The petty concerns reveal themselves as petty. The desperate grasping loosens. The constructed identity, all the roles you play, all the achievements you've accumulated, all the opinions you defend, all of it is seen for what it is: temporary, contingent, ultimately irrelevant.